You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, this is Ankit Panda, your host from New York City.
And this is Prashant Parmaswaran from Washington, D.C.
Good to hear from you again, Prashant, although I just saw you a few days ago. How are you doing?
Yeah, that's right. How are you doing?
Doing well, doing well. For listeners, so first of all, let me apologize that we didn't have a podcast last week as we promised on the previous episode. But that was actually because Prashant and I both ended up in Singapore, where we once again were attending the International Institute for Strategic Studies annual Shangri-La Dialogue, the Asia-Pacific's, or rather Indo-Pacific's foremost forum on defense issues, featuring defense ministers from around the region and a few from outside the region as well. So it's always a great experience to go to the Shangri-La Dialogue. This year was my third, and Prashant, I think this was your fourth?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, yeah, so we've both been going for a while, and it's been really interesting to see the trends over the years and how things are changing. The context for this year's dialogue, I think, is worth underscoring. We're obviously into the third year of the Trump administration, so the novelty of America First, I guess, that I remember observing during my first Shangri-La dialogue in 2017, that's kind of worn off, and now great power rivalry is very much the core theme. Of course, we had a keynote address on the opening night of the dialogue, featuring the Singaporean Prime Minister, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, who delivered a well-received speech, I think really setting the tone for the rest of the dialogue, which of course is what a keynote speech is supposed to do. But Prime Minister Lee spoke very candidly, I thought, from the perspective of a small country caught between great powers. We heard analogies thrown around over the weekend over what happens to the grass when elephants fight, so to speak. And it should go without saying that the escalation in the trade war, the heating up rhetoric between the United States and China really was tense throughout the dialogue. And, of course, this time we had an acting Secretary of Defense of the United States, Patrick Shanahan, in Singapore delivering the speech that in previous years we heard from U.S. Defense Secretaries. Shanahan has a confirmation hearing coming up soon, so he likely will be confirmed. But I think there's still no mistaking that he wasn't necessarily given the same time of day that a fully confirmed U.S. Secretary of Defense would have received. And perhaps for that very reason, we had for the first time in 8 years the confirmation of participation by China's defense minister, General Wei Fenghe. So we'll talk a bit about all of these issues. And I should say before we get into our discussion today that it was very nice to actually run into a lot of podcast listeners in Singapore at the Shangri-La Dialogue who expressed some anticipation of this episode. Unfortunately, I didn't have my recording equipment with me in Singapore, so we had to wait a little bit until we both got back stateside. But again, thanks to all of you who we ran into, who listened to the podcast and have been supporters for a while now. But Prashant, I wanted to begin, I guess, at the start of the dialogue with some thoughts from you on what Prime Minister Lee had to say. And in particular, I'd be curious to hear if you think what he said is really a message that resonates more broadly with Southeast Asian countries. Because I think there was some evidence that was the case. But do you think that Singapore really took the opportunity to position itself as the leader, so to speak, of the Southeast Asian concerns about great power rivalry?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's definitely how they tried to frame it. So I think if you look at Lee Hsien Loong's previous keynote address at the Shangri-La Dialogue in 2015, and you contrast it to what's going on in 2019, you get a really good sense of how much things have worsened on the U.S.-China relationship dynamics and how it affects the region. So in 2015, he spoke about this idea of a shifting balance of power in a very sort of general way in which we were thinking about this. But in his address, he went into a lot of specifics about, how the openness of the order was at stake, how small countries are forced to make false choices sometimes. He related various anecdotes about Southeast Asia's history and its, these various competing major powers and sort of drew analogies to the present. And I think, that showed both the state of Southeast Asia with respect to U.S.-China relations, now the state of anxiety in the region. But I think it also showed, to your point about, how this resonates in the region, there really are so few spokespeople in Southeast Asia in terms of leaders that are actually willing to speak out on U.S.-China dynamics, right? So Lee Hsien Loong is one, Mahathir from Malaysia, again, another individual who's no stranger to speaking out. But in Indonesia, you have a president who isn't as outspoken, right, with respect to U.S.-China rivalry. Duterte is, but in so in a very colorful and perhaps not a very strategic way. So I think there really is a demand for voices in the region to actually speak out on this, which is why I think you saw Prime Minister Lee's speech actually referenced a lot by other Southeast Asian participants and ministers at the dialogue and subsequent sessions, right?
Hmm.
Whether it was the Philippine defense secretary who referenced it, the Malaysian defense minister also referenced it a number of times in his remarks. So I think Southeast Asia, was crying out for somebody who'd be able to sort of speak to this, and he did so in a very careful and calibrated fashion, right? He spoke about the United States and China, but didn't speak a lot about President Trump and President Xi almost at all on the speech.
Yeah,
So I think it was a very calibrated and careful decision by the Singaporeans and how they wanted to reflect that.
yeah, I think so. I mean, my reaction was a little different, I guess. I mean, I liked the speech. I thought it was actually quite an honest speech in the sense that it probably actually portrayed what the Singaporean leadership feels when it witnesses the trade war playing out, and so to speak. But on the other hand, parts of the speech, even though they weren't necessarily pointed at the leadership of either country too directly, I thought were a little risky for a country like Singapore to really put itself out there and offering a diagnosis of what ails the United States and what ails China. And they did that carefully. And I think, Singaporean Defense Minister Ng, who spoke on the final plenary session on Sunday, I mean, he went a little bit further too. He started talking about the causes of political malaise in the United States, including things like the opioid crisis. So Singapore is very much
Mhm.
inserting itself into the great power dynamics at play. But overall, I thought it was a very strong speech. Of course, we had that question on Huawei. Huawei, I should also add, was a major keyword throughout this year's Shangri-La dialogue, given the U.S. action against the company in May, which we just discussed on a recent podcast. If you're more interested in our thoughts on that. But I think his answer on that also reflected a high degree of preparation and something I think people have known for a while now about Lee Hsien Loong, that he's articulate and clearly well versed in the issues that he was discussing.
Mhm.
So moving on, we had this rare TikTok between the United States and China. We heard from Secretary of Defense Shanahan, Acting Secretary of Defense Shanahan, rather, on Saturday morning, and then on Sunday morning, General Wei Fenghe presenting a Chinese perspective. And I don't know how you felt, but I thought there was a vast difference between how the two speeches were presented and received by the audience there. So Shanahan very much, I think, lacked the gravitas of a Mattis, not only because of the differences in persona between the two men, but also the way in which he delivered the speech, the content of the speech itself, the fact that we had no actual reference to the Indo-Pacific strategy review, which was just released as Shanahan spoke during his speech, and then of course the Chinese defense minister really being unapologetic, sort of relishing in the experience at Shangri-La of warding off all of these questions. He was enthusiastic, energetic, and he was the highlight of the dialogue, even if he wasn't so in the right way, in the sense that the message he delivered, I don't think, was particularly reassuring to many in the region. But that was my overall impression between the two leaders. And just to hit back on your point about the Southeast Asian leaders, one of my favorite interactions on the sidelines of this year's dialogue came on Sunday when I was speaking with an Indonesian official who I asked about how he felt about the dialogue this year, and the line that he said that stuck with me was that it feels like the United States and China are here to have a debate in my living room, and that was interesting. It was sort of that idea of ASEAN centrality that comes up every year in Shangri-La dialogues, the idea of the Southeast Asians feeling like spectators in their own backyard to a
Mhm.
broader great power showdown. But so how would you rate respectively the performances by Shanahan and General Wei?
Yeah, I mean, I think the contrast between the two of them was quite evident, right? So as you said, I mean, with Shanahan, there was always going to be a very high bar, given, Mattis's performances at the Shangri-La dialogue previously, and also, Mattis's role as kind of, reassurer in chief, right, in
Hmm.
the Trump administration. So, Shanahan had a high bar, and also I do think that, with Wei Fenghe and the Chinese, the fact that he even showed up, the bar was quite low for the Chinese, right? The fact that he was there was already so much hype about the fact that he even arrived because this was the highest level that the Chinese had sent in what, close to a decade, right, to the dialogue. So the fact that he was there, folks were interested in hearing his perspective. But the US, we've been hearing this constant message in terms of substance from the Trump administration. So I think the focus was more on style rather than substance. And I think on style, Wei Fenghe, I mean, the substance wise, it was quite predictable in terms of what he was saying. I mean,
Right.
all the traditional lines. But I thought in the Q&A, he kind of, lightened up a little bit once he actually, sort of engaged with the audience. Cracked a couple of jokes in there, and he seemed a little bit more comfortable relative to Shanahan. I think who was a bit guarded, mostly because the questions he received were sort of doubting U.S. policy and credibility when he was there to sort of say, well, the United States is here, we have this new strategy. It didn't seem like the message resonated with the audience, but I think part of that was because there was a lot of confusion as to, what he was saying versus the release of the report, and most of the folks hadn't actually read the report or were aware that it was coming out to time with the dialogue, right?
Yeah, that's
So,
right. I
and
mean,
it's it was a 60 plus page report, so there's no way that folks were going to get through it as he was speaking, right? So,
yeah, no, I had to go back to my hotel room later that night and read the report. It was a bit of a kind of a mess up, I think, when it comes to public diplomacy and messaging, that you release this really important strategy document while all of Asia's security watchers are convened in meetings all day and don't actually have time to reflect on it. So if they'd released it a week earlier, I think that would have been probably the better move. Then we could have all had some time to digest it and then actually had a conversation around it at Shangri-La.
yep.
Also on Shanahan, I mean, yeah, just the way he, I think, interacted with the audience during the Q&A wasn't very reassuring. I think he asked the moderator to take fewer questions than had originally been planned, wanting to kind of end things before he had to interact too much with the audience. So it was rather a strange message. And of course,
Yeah.
General Wei also got, he got some tough questions, I guess, but probably, questions that he could have predicted. He was obviously speaking just days away from the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre, and he was asked about that. And, he delivered a chilling answer that, the actions that the Chinese government authorized on that day were what effectively secured
hmm
the party's prosperity. So I think that really shocked many people in the audience, certainly people that I spoke to. Yeah, so I think those two addresses this year really, I think, offered that great power TikTok. And I should add, also what I understand about the Chinese participation this year was that it was confirmed after Mattis's resignation.
hmm
I don't know if China calculated astutely that the United States wouldn't have a Senate confirmed Secretary of Defense by the time of the Shangri-La dialogue, but if they did, it paid off because I think General Wei really was what most people were anticipating, and also probably the highlight of the dialogue this year.
hmm Yep.
So, moving away a bit from the great powers, I think there's a lot of other issues to talk about this year's Shangri-La dialogue. So one of the things I found unfortunate, and this is not, in any way Double I Double S's fault or shortcoming, was the ironic absence of any high-level Indian representation the very year that the Indo-Pacific is at the center of the Shangri-La dialogue. That was very much
hmm
a question that came up in a lot of the discussions and side discussions and sideline interactions, is the distinction between the Asia-Pacific and the Indo-Pacific strategy, the free and open Indo-Pacific, the geography of the Indo-Pacific. What is this concept? What does it mean to a variety of people? And of course, India, New Delhi, has a lot of sort of strong and interesting views on that issue, and we didn't really get to hear an Indian perspective this year. And of course, the reasoning for that has to do with the fact that India didn't have a government as the Shangri-La dialogue opened. And Narendra Modi was just being sworn in, and he did appoint a defense minister, Rajnath Singh, during the dialogue. But of course, somebody would have to write a speech for the new defense minister to deliver, and it just wasn't a practical time frame for the Indians to come and participate in a plenary session. So that I thought was unfortunate. But zooming out a bit from that and reflecting on this Indo-Pacific dilemma, I kind of got the sense that by the end of the dialogue, a lot of the participants grew a little bit tired of the Indo-Pacific debate. It's not as if we got a lot of clarity across the speeches, and we heard a predictable endorsement of the concept by officials from Japan, Australia, the United States. The South Korean defense minister, I think, was more reticent, and we heard at a side session at least, Russian Deputy Defense Minister Alexander Fomin actually deliver a criticism of the Indo-Pacific as a bloc designed to contain rising powers, including China and also implicitly Russia in his comments. But, going to Shangri-La this year, did you really get what you were hoping for on the broader Indo-Pacific debate, or did it seem like, things kind of fizzled a little?
Yeah, I mean, I think the sense you provided is right in terms of it. The conversation seems to almost have plateaued a little bit, and kind of the dividing lines have become clearer. So the noticeable stuff that we saw last year will kind of reinforce this year in terms of, none of the Southeast Asian delegates really referenced the Indo-Pacific in any meaningful way, right?
Mm-hmm.
And with the Chinese and also the Russians, there was a sense that this is actually something hostile directed at them, or it's an exclusive concept that comes at their expense. But you also heard from, from Australia, from Japan, from France and other countries that, already naturally have an Indo-Pacific strategy or approach or vision. They are sort of doubling down on the concept, and they've actually come out with details, including, Australia. I thought was really interesting that they provided more of a sense of how the Pacific fits into the Indo-Pacific, right? Given the fact that there have been more conversations about the South Pacific and the Australians feeling like they really need to own that aspect of the strategy. So I think you're seeing a concretization of things that we're already seeing, but I agree with you. I mean, there isn't really much in terms of substance that's new. I think, ironically, we talked about Shanahan and the release of the Indo-Pacific Strategy Report. That's probably one of the key substantive things that we got from the dialogue that's actually quite significant, right? Because we've talked about the Indo-Pacific vision and the Trump administration's approach, and there's always been this question, is this actually going to translate into a strategy? Are these people really thinking about this? And I think the fact that there is a document, that there is a strategy, at least shows that the Pentagon is invested in this and they're actually doing it. But obviously, that raises questions about A, whether this is going to translate into funding and it's going to sustain beyond the Trump administration with the election next year. And then the second question is, obviously, we've heard this from the Pentagon, but are all the other agencies involved in similar ways, and are they resourcing to a similar level to ensure coordination in U.S. policy? We don't know that, but I do think that that Indo-Pacific Strategy Report was a good illustration of a substantive point of progress for the U.S. approach, at least.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Yeah, so, I mean, the sense that I got again talking to Southeast Asian delegates is that the effort made last year by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who was the keynote last year, and Jim Mattis, the idea that the Indo-Pacific is complementary to and respects ASEAN centrality, I think those concerns remain in place. That for Southeast Asia, I think endorsing the Indo-Pacific concept is being seen as shorthand for endorsing effectively a containment strategy. And that's been, I think, one of the messaging challenges around the Indo-Pacific that I think the U.S. has gotten right at points. I think the most effective parts of messaging embedded in Shanahan's speech. I mean, look, I thought Shanahan's speech had a lot going on. We heard at points it sounded like a U.S. Department of Defense fact sheet on everything the United States was doing in Asia. We started hearing about the U.S.-Mongolia bilateral relationship, and it was just very discordant at times. But the most effective parts were the emphasis on the Indo-Pacific strategy being designed to maximize sovereignty. And I think that's what a lot of these countries want to hear, that they're not being forced to choose, as Prime Minister Lee warned, between the U.S. and China. But what the United States and its like-minded partners are trying to do is maximize the room for maneuver for all of these countries in the region, small, medium, and large, so that they don't have to feel coerced. And I think that, unfortunately, didn't get played up as much as it could. So I think the dialogue ended with the conversation sort of plateauing, as you noted, but also a lot of the people who came who weren't convinced about the Indo-Pacific strategy to begin with, I think probably also left with a similar degree of skepticism about the effort. I think one of the things that also struck me about halfway through the dialogue this year was that this could have been a very different sort of Shangri-La dialogue, right? I mean, I think Prime Minister Lee did do an effective job of setting the tone for the discussion in terms of great power competition. But of course, he wasn't meant to keynote this year. It was supposed to be French President Emmanuel Macron, who withdrew for a variety of reasons, but he'd been confirmed to deliver the keynote this year. And France, I think, made an interesting splash at this year's Shangri-La dialogue. We've talked before on this podcast about external powers in the Indo-Pacific, and of course, the French have always used Shangri-La, I think, for an important show of their presence in the region. Jean-Yves Le Drian in 2016, I think, delivered a pretty major speech at Shangri-La about France's interest in the South China Sea. But Florence Parly, the French defense minister, returned this year, and I think she delivered probably the strongest speech, in my opinion. I think a lot of the other delegates kind of shared that view, especially Western delegates, I should add. I think she delivered the most cogent defense of the rules-based order, while also making a case for why France is an Indo-Pacific nation. And as we've discussed
Yeah,
before,
with a
France
little bit
has...
of humor too. Yeah.
Yeah, no, yeah. So that's actually, yeah, I should probably point that out. So she poked. So she was speaking on the same panel as Penny Mordaunt, the new British defense minister, defense secretary, and she said that she hadn't come to Singapore alone. She'd brought along the Charles de Gaulle, France's only aircraft carrier, which I actually got to board on Sunday, which was a nice experience. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that later. But yeah, I think it was an important reminder that, France has an expeditionary power projection capability in the Asia Pacific right now, while the UK waits for its next generation carriers to get up and running. But I really thought the French, made the most of it, even without the keynote this year. Again, I think there was some concern about France effectively using its colonial possessions in the Indo-Pacific region to justify why it's an Indo-Pacific country. I think that's a point well taken. There are, 1.5 million French citizens living in these territories, as I think Florence Parly said in her speech. And also the reminder, as we always keep hearing from the French, about the fact that they actually have the most exclusive economic zone of any country in the Indo-Pacific, depending on how far you want to go.
Yep.
But do you share that assessment of the French defense minister's speech this year? And also, I think just the whole idea of Macron kind of keynoting this and making a case for outside powers in the Indo-Pacific, I think could have been quite interesting.
Yeah, that's right. And I think this goes to the point that you emphasized earlier, which I think is really important as a broader point for Shangri-La, right? So this was traditionally something where you saw a lot more of a focus on Asia. It's an Asian security dialogue. But you've had over the past few years an increasing amount of European representation, but also more generally extra regional powers, as you noted, right? So we had participation this year. The French were here, the British, but also the Canadians, right? The Canadian defense minister was here for a second year running as well. So you are seeing this, and this plays into U.S. strategy too, right? I think the United States has tried to emphasize this point about the rules-based order and preserving principles. But the allies that they're using are not only allies in Asia, they're also sort of talking about the Europeans, they're talking about the Canadians and other countries helping to sort of preserve the rules-based order. And it's good to have a more inclusive conversation that's not only just about the United States as being the only extra-regional player. This is a broader conversation. And I think this year, Sweden also had representation as well. So it's interesting to see this overall increase in European participation the last few years that we've been there.
Yeah, yeah. I will say about France, this is not a reflection on the defense minister's speech, I should say, but, so when I was on board the Charles de Gaulle, we got a briefing from a French official about the Indo-Pacific and France. And of course, we heard, many of the same points that the defense minister delivered. But, we were given actually this document that the French had prepared, which is available publicly on their website, totally unclassified. But it was, again, that description of the geography of the Indo-Pacific and where France is. And it was this really interesting map of the Indo-Pacific region with lines drawn, showing off France's massive EEZ with French flags everywhere. And actually, at one point, again, a Southeast Asian official came up to me and made a joke that, can you imagine how people would react in this part of the world if you had Chinese officials show up in an aircraft carrier handing out maps with circles drawn for their EEZ claims and flags everywhere, which, point well taken. Obviously, I think, the French claims are slightly different. Obviously, these are part of French territory. But what was most interesting is that map also was accompanied by a charting of French naval deployments in the Indo-Pacific over the past 3 years. And it was very interesting to note that the naval deployments actually didn't correspond to the location of French territories whatsoever. France talks about French Polynesia, Clipperton, all the way, by Mexico in the very far reaches of the Pacific. And then, of course, it's southern Indian Ocean territories. But most of its naval deployments, like you would expect, are to the north, at least north of the equator, in the South China Sea, in the northern Indian Ocean, nearby the Korean Peninsula. So that, I think, mismatch in what France says it's in the Indo-Pacific for and what it actually ends up doing I found to be quite interesting. And I think, the French should lean into that. This whole justification that we're an Indo-Pacific country because of our territories and our 1.5 million citizens. I think that's probably good for domestically justifying these kinds of deployments. But honestly, the beauty of the rules-based order should be that any country, especially a P5 member like France, can be in the Indo-Pacific participating in these activities. And that actually takes me to another thing that I found interesting during the dialogue was that the Korean Peninsula did not come up as much as it did last year. Obviously, we heard from, there was a plenary session that featured the Japanese and Korean defense ministers speaking about the issue, but alongside the EU High Representative, Federica Mogherini, which was a really good session, I thought. But one of the interesting things was the sanctions enforcement activities in the Indo-Pacific and how prominent that was this year. So obviously this was coming just shortly after the U.S. Department of Justice seized and towed the Wise Honest, the second largest tanker in North Korea's commercial fleet, for its participation in illicit activities. And the enforcement of UN Security Council Resolution 2375 was something that several officials referenced. I think we heard it from the Canadians, the French, the Brits, the United States, Japan. And I think the reason we heard about it so much is that it is a very good example of a component of enforcing the rules-based order that has very little directly to do with China, in that, we now see naval and Coast Guard deployments designed to monitor North Korean illicit ship-to-ship transfers at sea that are sanctioned by a United Nations Security Council resolution. So China can't necessarily point to those activities as, at least part of a so-called containment approach towards Beijing. And of course, there was a China angle to this. Shanahan talked about a picture book being given to China showing illicit ship-to-ship transfers taking place within Chinese territorial waters. But that was a really interesting component. And I think, that's probably a good thing that we are talking about these components of maritime activities that have to do with really, if there's anything rules-based about the order in Asia, it is probably the UN Security Council sanctions enforcement regime around North Korea. So it was quite interesting to hear that come up a lot this year.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it really is striking if you think about like the last few iterations of the Shangri-La dialogue, when you have changes in the areas of focus, they're usually quite dramatic, right? So in 2017, we had this, it was right after the Marawi attacks. So terrorism was kind of front and center. It was very clearly the focus of the dialogue. And then last year, North Korea was definitely, front and center because you had Shangri-La dialogue right before the first summit between Trump and Kim. And this year, the US-China competition dynamic was just so visible as the theme that, it was unmistakable, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, North Korea, relative to last year, I agree with you. I mean, definitely is a dramatic reduction in terms of the focus this year. I think the other thing that was really interesting was, several of the Southeast Asian countries were trying to reference, it was almost like they wanted to sort of mention the China piece and South China Sea to some degree. But relative to last year in particular, I thought the content on South China Sea was actually quite limited.
Oh, yeah.
And they were trying to focus more on, transnational crimes and terrorism, and we need to strengthen institutions. And South China Sea was almost like, Shanahan spent more time on that, and the Chinese spent more time on that, talking about it rather than the Southeast Asian states themselves.
Yeah, well, I mean, no, you're absolutely right. I'm really glad you brought that up. But even with Shanahan in the Western countries, I mean, the South China Sea was just way less prominent this year. I mean, Shanahan kind of did the laundry list of, we condemn the militarization of features, yada, yada. And it's also interesting that when he was talking about the South China Sea, initially at least, he was doing a very kind of, 2015 Obama administration style criticism of, certain countries in the South China Sea, not naming China. And then, of course, later in his speech, he named China. So I'm not sure what was going on at the staffing level there. Maybe they were cutting and pasting from old speeches, but that I found to be a little odd. But yeah, I mean, it's especially ironic because last year, such a prominent theme among all the Western defense ministers was that, none of us are going to stand up and accept China's fait accompli in the South China Sea. And this year, by virtue of the lower profile of the South China Sea more broadly, I think exactly that has happened, that the idea that China has gotten away with militarizing these islands came up. I don't actually recall, it might have been a Shanahan speech, but I don't actually recall any references to the 2016 arbitral tribunal ruling.
No, I think it came up in maybe the Q&A
Okay.
rather than in the speeches in terms of like, making sure that any code of conduct is in line with
Right.
international law. And but you're right, I don't think any of the speeches particularly referenced that. And that was definitely front and center in earlier iterations of the dialogue. And I think, the point about I know we're going back to this, we've already said it, but I do want to emphasize, I mean, there really were some really big disconnects between what Shanahan was saying and what the Indo-Pacific Strategy Report said.
Yeah.
So you're right. I mean, he didn't mention he wasn't tough on China or harsh on China, but the Indo-Pacific Strategy Report, had very tough wording for China, and China actually and Wei Fenghe in his address seemed to be reacting to the report rather than what Shanahan was saying, because Shanahan dialed down the criticism of China in his remarks.
Yeah.
But and so it was very difficult to see if the delegates were responding to what Shanahan was saying or what the report was saying. It's the same thing with ASEAN centrality. The actual Indo-Pacific Strategy Report goes into a lot of detail about ASEAN centrality and multilateralism. But I think in Shanahan's speech, he only mentioned ASEAN centrality just once as kind of a passing reference, and then moved on. So,
Yeah. No, I mean, overall, I don't think he was received particularly strongly this year.
mhm.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, the South China Sea, I think, just really jumped out at me. Just that, yeah, absolutely. After saying in 2018 that you're not going to accept the fait accompli, I think the international community has just come to terms with the new realities in the South China Sea. And of course, we heard from um, the Malaysian defense minister, Sabu, about the South China Sea after, I believe, three questioners had to pester him to answer the one question about Laconia Shoals. And then
Mhm.
he finally addressed it. And Lorenzana from the Philippines also, warned about not sleepwalking into war. So there's this perception among this, at least the Southeast Asian defense ministers, a lot of them, that talking about the South China Sea will only make things worse in this time of great power competition, rather than improve things, at least from a Southeast Asian perspective, which is troubling again because I think it's entirely the wrong direction for the region to be moving in. So we are running out of time. I know that we have a lot to talk about when it comes to Shangri-La, but just one closing reflection I wanted to offer when you were talking about the themes every year being obvious and really stemming from the news cycle.
Mhm.
I agree with that. But one of the things that I thought was sort of a gaping hole at this year's Shangri-La, and maybe why I've always felt that the Shangri-La dialogue is an Asia-Pacific security conference. It's not an Indo-Pacific security conference. It's very much concerned with affairs that occur, east of the Malacca Strait. Was the complete absence of any discussion at any level. There wasn't even a side event about this year, about the near total war between India and Pakistan in February.
Mhm.
I mean, this is an Asian security conference. That I think was probably the most serious and disturbing development this year in many ways, given the potential downside. But it didn't come up. And, it's not like that there hasn't been precedents for India-Pakistan issues being discussed at Shangri-La. The Pakistanis sent very limited representation this year. I think it was only non-governmental, actually. So we didn't have Indian high-level participation because of the government formation, and the Pakistanis didn't send anyone, even though in previous years we've had, Pakistani military officers at the plenary sessions even sitting on the stage. So that was a pretty glaring gap this year. But again, I think it emphasized that the origins of the Shangri-La dialogue are very much in the kind of old understanding of the Asia Pacific, being Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, Oceania, and the Pacific. And so I think
Mhm.
this year we saw the dialogue return to those roots a little bit, which is again ironic because everybody I think came to Singapore this year expecting to have their ears bleeding with mentions of the Indo-Pacific by the end of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, Prashant, we'll end it there, and
Mhm.
hopefully for people I ran into in Singapore who were looking forward to this discussion, this about covered everything that we had to do. But I suspect we'll come back to a few other takeaways from Shangri-La in the upcoming episodes. There's a lot certainly going on. But Prashant, thanks a lot for joining me. It was good seeing you in Singapore last week.
Yeah, good to be with you.
Great. So, for our listeners, if you've been listening to the podcast for a while but you haven't yet subscribed, make sure you do so you can catch up with future episodes, which are very similar to this one. And if you've been a subscriber for a while but you haven't yet left us a review, please do so on your platform of choice. Again, a reminder that we are available for subscription on Google Play, iTunes, Spotify, and a range of other third-party providers as well. And we'd love to have your review at any of those. So, thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back next week with more.